The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his red tunic one final time. The 28-year-old guardsman had been protecting the royal family for 6 years, and he knew the rules by heart. Stand perfectly still, eyes forward. Never break character. Never speak to tourists. These weren't just guidelines. They were sacred traditions that had been followed for centuries. Outside the palace gates, hundreds of tourists gathered as they did every morning, cameras ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood the Thompson family from Manchester, David, Sarah, and their 7-year-old daughter Emma. This wasn't just any family vacation. It was Emma's wish trip, carefully planned around her cancer treatment schedule. Emma had been battling acute lymphoblastic leukemia for 8 months. The chemotherapy had taken her golden curls, leaving her with a bright pink knit cap that she wore everywhere. Despite everything she'd been through, the hospital stays, the painful treatments, the days when she was too weak to get out of bed, Emma's spirit remained unbroken. Her biggest dream was to see the royal guards at Buckingham Palace, the same ones she'd read about in her favorite storybooks. As the family approached the palace gates, Emma pressed her face against the iron bars, her eyes wide with wonder. She had studied pictures of the guards for months, memorizing every detail of their uniforms. The tall black hats called bearskins, the bright red tunics with golden buttons, the polished black boots that reflected the morning light. To her, they weren't just soldiers, they were real-life heroes from a fairy tale. Sarah Thompson watched her daughter with a mixture of joy and sadness. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic about Emma's progress, but the road ahead was still uncertain. This trip to London was about creating beautiful memories, about giving Emma something magical to hold on to during the difficult days that lay ahead. The crowd began to murmur with excitement as the ceremony was about to begin. Emma climbed onto her father's shoulders to get a better view, her pink cap a bright spot of color among the sea of tourists. She clutched a small handmade sign that read, "Thank you for keeping the Queen safe," in her careful 7-year-old handwriting. Sergeant Morrison took his position at the gate, his face a mask of professional composure. He had done this ceremony hundreds of times before. The routine was always the same. March in formation, stand at attention, and maintain the dignity of the position no matter what happened around him. Tourists would wave, children would giggle, and cameras would flash, but a Queen's Guard never responded. It was the ultimate test of discipline and dedication. As the ceremony began, Emma watched in amazement as the guards moved in perfect synchronization. Their movements were precise and graceful, like a carefully choreographed dance. She had never seen anything so magnificent in her young life. The music from the band filled the air, and for a moment Emma forgot about hospitals and medicine and pain. She was just a little girl watching her heroes come to life. But something unexpected was about to happen that would change everything. As Sergeant Morrison marched past the Thompson family, he caught sight of the small girl on her father's shoulders. The pink cap drew his attention first, but it was Emma's expression that made him pause internally. Her face was filled with pure wonder and admiration, the kind of innocent joy that reminded him why he had chosen to serve in the first place. For just a split second, their eyes met through the palace gates. Emma smiled and held up her little sign, mouthing the words "thank you" with such genuine gratitude that it touched something deep in the soldier's heart. In that moment, Sergeant Morrison faced a choice that would test everything he had been trained to do. The weight of tradition pressed down on his shoulders, but something even stronger was stirring in his chest, the simple human desire to bring joy to a child who had already faced more challenges than most adults ever would. The ceremony continued around them, but for Sergeant Morrison, time seemed to slow down. He could hear his commanding officer's voice in his head, reciting the regulations that had been drilled into him during training. A Queen's Guard is a symbol of unwavering duty. Personal feelings must never interfere with protocol. The uniform represents something greater than any individual soldier. Yet as he continued his march, Morrison couldn't shake the image of Emma's hopeful face. During his years of service, he had seen thousands of tourists come and go. Most were simply curious visitors taking photos, but occasionally someone would touch his heart in an unexpected way. There had been the elderly veteran who saluted him with tears in his eyes, remembering his own days of military service. There was the young boy who had saved his pocket money for months just to visit London and see the guards. But Emma was different somehow. After the formal ceremony concluded, Morrison remained at his post for the standard guard duty. The crowds began to thin as tourists moved on to other attractions, but the Thompson family lingered. Emma had convinced her parents to stay a little longer, hoping to get one more glimpse of her favorite guard. She had somehow picked Morrison out from all the others, perhaps sensing something special about the way he carried himself. David Thompson noticed his daughter's fascination and gently suggested they visit the gift shop to buy a souvenir. But Emma shook her head, her small hand gripping the palace gates. "I want to say thank you properly, Daddy," she whispered. "He looks kind. I can see it in his eyes." Sarah's heart clenched at her daughter's words. Throughout Emma's treatment, she had maintained an almost supernatural ability to see goodness in people. The nurses always commented on how Emma could brighten their entire day with just a smile. Even during her most difficult moments, she worried more about making others feel better than about her own pain. Morrison stood motionless at his post, but his mind was racing. He thought about his own childhood, growing up in a small village in Wales. His grandmother had always told him that true strength wasn't about following rules blindly, but about knowing when compassion mattered more than protocol. "Sometimes, Jimmy," she used to say, "the bravest thing you can do is show kindness when nobody expects it." The morning stretched on, and most of the tourist crowds had dispersed. Only a few people remained near the gates, including the Thompson family. Emma had grown tired and was now sitting on a small bench nearby, but she kept her eyes fixed on Morrison. Her mother had packed some snacks, and Emma was sharing her sandwich with a friendly pigeon that had wandered close. It was then that Morrison noticed something that made his decision for him. Emma's pink cap had slipped slightly, revealing the pale scalp underneath. Even from his position, he could see that she was fighting a battle far more challenging than anything he had ever faced as a soldier. This little girl was a warrior in her own right, facing each day with courage that put his military training to shame. The realization hit him like a thunderbolt. Here he was, worried about breaking protocol, while a 7-year-old girl was fighting for her life and still finding ways to spread joy to others. What kind of man would he be if he couldn't find the courage to acknowledge such bravery? What would his grandmother think if she knew he had chosen rules over kindness when it mattered most? Morrison's internal struggle intensified as he watched Emma carefully rewrap her leftover sandwich and offer it to another pigeon. Her parents were discussing whether they should head back to their hotel for Emma's afternoon rest, but she was clearly reluctant to leave. Every few minutes she would look up at Morrison with hope in her eyes, as if she was waiting for some sign of acknowledgement. The weight of his decision pressed heavily on Morrison's shoulders. Breaking protocol could mean disciplinary action, possibly even dismissal from the guard. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for could be at risk. But as he stood there in his scarlet uniform, representing honor and duty, he began to understand that sometimes the highest form of duty is the duty to human compassion. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast different shadows across the palace courtyard when Morrison made his choice. His shift would be ending soon, and he realized this might be his only opportunity to do something meaningful. The voice of duty warred with the voice of his heart. But in the end, his heart won. Very slowly, almost imperceptibly, Morrison began to turn his head toward Emma. It was a tiny movement, one that most people wouldn't even notice. But for a Queen's Guard, it was revolutionary. His eyes met Emma's once again, and this time he didn't look away. Emma's face transformed with joy. She sat up straighter on her bench, hardly daring to believe that the guard was actually looking at her. Her parents noticed immediately, following her gaze to see Morrison's subtle but unmistakable acknowledgement of their daughter. What happened next would be talked about for months afterward. Morrison, still maintaining his formal posture, gave Emma the slightest nod. It was barely a movement at all, just a gentle dip of his chin, but to Emma it might as well have been a royal wave. Her smile was so bright it could have powered the entire palace. But Morrison wasn't finished. Checking quickly to ensure his commanding officers weren't watching, he did something even more extraordinary. He raised his hand to his temple in a small, respectful salute, directed specifically at Emma. It was a soldier's recognition of a fellow warrior, an acknowledgement of her courage in fighting her own battle. Emma gasped with delight and immediately scrambled to her feet. With all the seriousness she could muster, she attempted her own salute in return. Her small hand pressed against her forehead in a gesture that was both adorable and deeply moving. The other tourists who witnessed this exchange began to smile and point, sensing they were watching something special unfold. Sarah Thompson felt tears spring to her eyes. In all the months of Emma's treatment, through all the procedures and setbacks, she had never seen her daughter look quite so proud and happy. This simple gesture from a stranger had given Emma something that no medicine could provide, a moment of pure joy and recognition of her own bravery. Morrison felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. This was why he had joined the Guard in the first place, not just to protect buildings and follow protocols, but to represent the very best of human values. Sometimes those values meant breaking the rules for something more important. As if sensing that their special moment was complete, Emma carefully reached into her small backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She had been carrying it all day, hoping for just such an opportunity. It was a drawing she had made during one of her hospital stays, depicting a brave guard standing watch over a castle, with a little girl waving from below. Emma approached the gate as close as she could get and held up the drawing for Morrison to see. Even from his position, he could make out the careful details she had included: the red uniform, the tall black hat, even tiny golden buttons. At the bottom, in her neat 7-year-old handwriting, she had written, "Thank you for being so brave." From Emma, age 7. Morrison's throat tightened with emotion. In 6 years of service, he had received commendations from officers, praise from tourists, and recognition from his peers. But nothing had ever meant as much to him as this simple drawing from a brave little girl who understood courage better than most adults ever would. The interaction was being noticed by more and more people. Other tourists had stopped to watch, some taking photos, others simply enjoying the beautiful moment unfolding before them. A few seemed to understand intuitively that this was about more than just a guard acknowledging a child. This was about human connection transcending the barriers of duty and protocol. Morrison knew his time was running short. His replacement would arrive soon for the next shift, and he needed to return to proper protocol. But he had one more gesture in mind, something that would give Emma a memory to treasure forever. It was risky, potentially career-ending, but as he looked at her hopeful face, he knew it was worth any consequence. Taking a deep breath, Morrison made a decision that would echo far beyond the palace walls. He began to walk slowly toward the gate where Emma stood waiting, her drawing pressed against the iron bars. Each step was deliberate and measured, carrying him further away from protocol and closer to a moment of pure human kindness. The growing crowd of onlookers held their breath. This was unprecedented. Queen's Guards simply didn't leave their posts to interact with tourists. Some visitors began recording on their phones, sensing they were witnessing something remarkable. Others just watched in amazed silence as the tall soldier in his magnificent red uniform approached the small girl in the pink cap. When Morrison reached the gate, he stopped just a few feet away from Emma. Up close, he could see the effects of her treatment more clearly: the pale complexion, the thin frame, the way she leaned slightly against her father for support. But he could also see something else, an inner strength that radiated from her like sunlight. Her eyes were bright with intelligence and kindness, unmarked by bitterness despite everything she had endured. "That's a beautiful drawing," Morrison said softly, his voice carrying just enough for Emma and her parents to hear. The simple words sent ripples through the crowd. A Queen's Guard had spoken to a civilian. The unthinkable had happened. Emma's face lit up with wonder. "You like it? I drew it in the hospital. I wanted to make it perfect for you." Her voice was sweet and clear, filled with the honest enthusiasm that only children possess. "It is perfect," Morrison replied, and he meant every word. "You're very talented, Emma." The fact that he knew her name sent another wave of surprise through the observers. David Thompson stepped forward slightly, his protective instincts engaged, but Morrison's kind expression reassured him that this was safe. "How did you know my name?" Emma asked, tilting her head curiously. Morrison smiled, the first genuine smile he had shown while on duty in years. "A good guard always pays attention to important visitors," he said. "And you, young lady, are very important indeed." Emma giggled, a sound so pure and joyful that several people in the crowd found themselves smiling despite themselves. My mummy says I'm brave like a soldier, she said proudly. She says I fight my battles just like you fight yours. The simple honesty of her words hit Morrison harder than any formal ceremony ever had. Here was a child who understood courage not as the absence of fear, but as the determination to keep going despite it. She faced needles and medicine and uncertainty with the same steadfast resolve he brought to his military duties. Your mother is absolutely right, Morrison said, his voice thick with emotion. You are one of the bravest soldiers I've ever met. What Morrison did next would become the heart of a story told around the world. He carefully removed one of the brass buttons from his uniform tunic, a button that bore the royal insignia, a symbol of his oath and service. It was against every regulation in the book, but as he looked at Emma's expectant face, he knew it was exactly the right thing to do. This is for you, he said, extending the gleaming button through the gate's bars. From one soldier to another, Emma's eyes grew wide as saucers. She looked up at her parents for permission, and when they nodded through their own tears, she carefully took the precious gift. The button was warm from Morrison's uniform and heavy in her small palm. She held it up to catch the sunlight, watching it gleam like gold. I'll keep it forever and ever, she promised solemnly, and whenever I have to be brave at the doctor, I'll hold it tight and remember that you think I'm a good soldier. Morrison knelt down to Emma's eye level, bringing himself as close to the gate as possible. Remember this, Emma, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed courtyard. True courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing what you have to do anyway. You've already shown more courage than most people ever will. The crowd around them had grown silent, witnessing something far more powerful than any formal ceremony. Phones continued to record, but even the photographers seemed to understand they were capturing something sacred, a moment when human compassion transcended all barriers and protocols. As Morrison stood up and prepared to return to his post, Emma pressed her drawing through the bars of the gate. This is for you, she said, echoing his own words, so you can remember me when you're standing guard. Morrison accepted the drawing with the same reverence he might show a military decoration. As he unfolded it carefully, he could see every detail Emma had lovingly included. The guard in her drawing stood tall and proud, but there was something else in the picture that caught his attention. The little girl below wasn't just waving. She was holding what looked like a small button that gleamed with golden crayon. Did you know this would happen? Morrison asked wonderingly. Emma shrugged with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possess. I hoped it would, she admitted. I dreamed about meeting a real guard who would understand about being brave. The exchange had not gone unnoticed by Morrison's fellow guards or his commanding officers. From the corner of his eye, he could see Sergeant Major Phillips approaching, his expression unreadable. Morrison's heart sank slightly, knowing he would likely face consequences for his actions, but he felt no regret. As Sergeant Major Phillips drew closer, the crowd began to murmur nervously. The atmosphere grew tense as people realized the soldier might be in trouble for his act of kindness. Emma sensed the change too, her joy dimming as she noticed the stern-looking officer approaching. Sergeant Morrison, the sergeant major called out formally. Morrison straightened to attention, but he kept Emma's drawing carefully protected in his hand. Yes, sir. What happened next surprised everyone present. Instead of the reprimand they expected, Sergeant Major Phillips looked directly at Emma and gave her a formal military salute. Miss Emma, he said with grave respect, it would be an honor if you would accept a small token of appreciation from all of us. From his pocket, he produced a small golden pin bearing the regimental insignia. This is for extraordinary courage under fire, he explained, offering it to the amazed little girl. We recognize a fellow warrior when we see one. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. Emma looked between the two soldiers with wide eyes, overwhelmed by the unexpected recognition. Her parents stood behind her with tears streaming down their faces, witnessing their daughter receive honors that most people could never imagine. But I'm just a little girl, Emma said quietly, her voice filled with awe. No, Sergeant Major Phillips replied firmly. You are a soldier in the truest sense. You face your battles with grace, dignity, and courage. That makes you one of us. The story of what happened that day began spreading even before the Thompson family left the palace grounds. Tourists who had witnessed the exchange shared photos and videos on social media. News outlets picked up the story, and within hours, Footage of Morrison's interaction with Emma was being viewed around the world. The response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from people everywhere, parents of children fighting similar battles, military personnel from various countries, and ordinary citizens who had been touched by the simple act of human kindness they had witnessed. The hashtag Dr. Emma's button began trending, with people sharing their own stories of courage and compassion. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. That evening, a handwritten note arrived at the palace, addressed simply to the kind guard and the brave little girl. It was from the Queen herself, who had heard about the day's events. The note, written in her distinctive handwriting, read, "True nobility lies not in following rules without question, but in recognizing when human compassion calls us to something higher. Today, both a soldier and a young lady demonstrated the finest qualities of courage and grace. They have made their country proud." Morrison framed both Emma's drawing and the Queen's note, hanging them side by side in his quarters. They served as daily reminders of why he wore the uniform, not just to follow orders, but to represent the very best of human values, even when that meant taking risks or breaking with tradition. Emma, meanwhile, kept her button and pin in a special jewelry box beside her bed. During her more difficult treatment days, she would hold them tightly and remember Morrison's words about courage being the choice to do what you must, despite being afraid. The memory of that magical day at the palace gave her strength through the challenges that lay ahead. 6 months later, Emma Thompson rang the bell at Manchester Children's Hospital to celebrate completing her final round of chemotherapy. Her hair had begun to grow back in soft brown curls, and her strength had returned along with her infectious smile. But she still carried Morrison's button everywhere she went, and the story of their encounter had become legendary in the hospital corridors. The video of their meeting had been viewed millions of times across the globe, inspiring countless acts of kindness. Children facing their own health battles drew pictures of brave guards standing watch. Military personnel around the world began looking for small ways to connect with the communities they served. Parents shared the story with their children as an example of how courage could be found in the most unexpected places. Morrison had indeed faced disciplinary action for breaking protocol, but the consequences were far different than anyone might have expected. Instead of punishment, he found himself promoted and assigned to a special community outreach program. The Royal Guard had recognized that his actions represented the highest ideals of military service on putting human welfare above rigid adherence to rules when compassion demanded it. The program Morrison now led connected military personnel with children facing serious illnesses. Guards would visit hospitals, not in their formal capacity, but as individuals sharing their own stories of courage and resilience. They taught children that bravery came in many forms, and that everyone could be a hero in their own battle. Emma became the unofficial ambassador for the program, speaking at events and sharing her story with other children who needed hope. Her natural charisma and hard-won wisdom made her an incredibly effective advocate. She would tell audiences about the day a soldier taught her that true courage wasn't about not being scared, but about choosing to be strong anyway. The ripple effects of that single moment of connection continued to spread. The story inspired a children's book, with proceeds going to cancer research. A scholarship was established in Emma's name for children who had overcome serious illnesses. The Royal Guards began a tradition of carrying special tokens that could be given to deserving young people who demonstrated exceptional courage. Morrison and Emma maintained their friendship through letters and occasional visits. He would update her on his work with the outreach program, and she would share news of her recovery and her dreams for the future. Their correspondence became a testament to the power of human connection to transcend differences in age, background, and circumstance. 1 year after their first meeting, Emma returned to Buckingham Palace, this time as an honored guest. She wore a beautiful blue dress and a small tiara that Morrison had arranged for her to borrow from the palace collection. Most importantly, she wore his button proudly pinned to her dress, alongside the regimental pin from Sergeant Major Phillips. This time, when the changing of the guard ceremony took place, Emma stood in a place of honor beside the palace gates. As Morrison marched past in formation, he gave her another subtle nod, but now it was approved protocol. The Royal Guards had officially recognized that their highest duty was not just to protect the monarchy, but to embody the values of courage, compassion, and service that made the institution worthy of protection. Emma's story had taught them all that sometimes the most important battles are fought by the smallest soldiers, and that true greatness lies in recognizing heroism wherever it appears. The 7-year-old girl who had wanted nothing more than to thank a brave guard for his service had ended up teaching an entire institution about the real meaning of courage. As the ceremony concluded that day, Emma was invited to meet other members of the royal family. When asked what she had learned from her experience, she thought carefully before answering with the wisdom that had made her famous around the world. "I learned that being brave isn't about not being scared," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It's about choosing to do good things even when you are scared. And I learned that sometimes the most important thing a brave person can do is be kind to someone who needs kindness." The story of Emma, Thompson, and Sergeant Morrison became more than just a viral moment or a heartwarming news story. It became a reminder that in a world often focused on rules and regulations, the most powerful force remains simple human compassion. Their brief encounter had broken protocol, but it had also broken through barriers and touched hearts across the globe, proving that sometimes the bravest thing anyone can do is simply choose kindness over convention.